Hello, this is week 8 for environmental ethics, and this week we have a reading from Anthony Weston called Multicentrism, a Manifesto. And again, this week, like previous weeks, I want to just set up the reading and give you some clues as to how to access it and how to make sense of it. So, the Multicentrism Manifesto, if we can call it that, is really a way to respond to what is this sort of expanding circle of moral inclusion. Peter Singer has called this the sort of expansionist approach to moral philosophy. That is, we define a center of a circle, like anthropocentrism or animalcentrism or biocentrism. And then from that center, we can draw a circle which defines who is included in the community of moral subjects and who is or what is excluded from the community of moral subjects. And as you remember from our readings of Peter Singer and some of the animal ethicists and people who think like that, this idea of widening the circle of inclusion to get greater inclusivity seems to be the strategy of a lot of moral innovation. In fact, the biggest implementation of this, and probably the completion of the project, we see with the Antocentrism that comes to us from Luciano Floridi's information ethics. If you remember from our reading of Luciano Floridi, the idea is to describe the widest possible circle of inclusion by defining the center of that circle as ontocentric. That is, anything that exists, has existed, or will exist is a qualifying entity for inclusion in the community of moral subjects. The only thing that is excluded is nothing. And that would seem to be the most totalizing or universal form of this kind of moral centrism. This week with Anthony Weston's piece, we're going to challenge this strategy. Weston finds that this, what he calls a moral geometry, has some problems. That is, whenever we define a center and widen the circle, that seems to be more inclusive, but inevitably, this effort, this strategy, always makes exclusions. There's always something left out, even if what's left out is nothing, as in the case of information ethics. So Weston is going to argue for a brand new moral geometry, as he calls it, which he calls multicentrism. That is a way of defining moral inclusion that doesn't depend on one center and one concentric or set of concentric circles around that center, but rather multiple centers for a plurality of overlapping circles of moral inclusion. And this is going to make, in his mind, for a much more interesting form of moral inclusion that is more complicated than the centrisms of the past and can break with some of the problems that we get from the moral inclusion-exclusion problem that occurs with anthropocentrism, biocentrism, or even ontocentrism. Now, what you're going to be reading is a manifesto. And one of the questions I ask you this week is, what is a manifesto? What do we expect from a manifesto? I can just hint in that direction. I want you to think about it more as you do the reading. But obviously, a manifesto is not about creating a system. So the multicentric proposal that's made by Weston isn't going to be a brand new system of moral inclusion, but it is going to be a challenge. It's going to be a sort of critical response to a long history of problems with moral inclusion based on one form of centrism or another. So one of the questions I do want you to engage with is, what is a manifesto? Why does somebody write a manifesto? What do we expect from a manifesto? And how is this multicentric proposal of Weston's a manifesto? How does it fit in that sort of literary genre? So that's it. I hope you enjoy the reading. I think it's a rather intriguing way of thinking beyond the limitations of previous forms of moral inclusion, and will challenge some rather deep-seated ideas we have about how we define moral inclusion versus moral exclusion, and hopefully open up the conversation to another way of thinking about who's in and who's out when it comes to defining moral subjectivity. That's all I have. Again, look at the questions before you do the reading. Use the questions to guide your reading process, and record answers to the questions in your journal or your reading log. Thanks, and I'll see you again next week. Bye-bye.